All right. It looks like the live button has been clicked. Usually give it a few seconds because it sometimes doesn't record the first few seconds for some reason. All right, Julian, thanks for coming on. Appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here and have this conversation. Me and Tom actually met during one of the Socratic circles that I do here. So I live in Minneapolis, and one of the things that I enjoy doing on weekends is hosting philosophy circles. And Tom joined one of these circles and was very eloquent and well spoken in one of the circles. And after it, we spent an hour and a half or so talking about just what came to mind. The topic at hand that day was human worth, and we were going through different problems like the trolley problem or the life raft problem. Who gets to live in a boat? And there's only one raft. Like, how do you select? How do you designate human worth, human value in such a constrained situation? And so that's one of the things that I like to do. I like to think of myself as someone who's exploring a lot of different domains and avenues. I like music. I enjoy writing. I enjoy poetry. I enjoy hosting philosophy circles as well as doing philosophy on my own. I have my own YouTube channel called Cusp of Infinity, and I also do podcasts and post on that. I've done podcasts with different yogis and thinkers and friends who also do podcasts. So this is pretty much aligned with what I already am doing with my life. So it's a pleasure, and I look forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Thanks. Appreciate you taking the time to have the conversation. So, what has been the topic that's been on your mind recently that you would like to talk about?
What hasn't been on my mind? So one of the things that I think orients my life is thinking about decisions. And I've had phases where I've been a little bit obsessed with decision theory, which is the idea of um, how to create strategies to make decisions that are as aligned or as perfect as possible. And one of the things that I've been sort of zeroing in on as one of the ways to do this is to have a very clear understanding of the values that I hold. And so writing the values down, refining them, understanding the values. And it's not really as much like, oh, just think of the values you like and write them down and that's it. It's more like over time, you learn your values through trial and error. They sort of come up through the exposure to circumstance and the sincerity to be honest with oneself. But I really do think that value has been a big element in my life recently in just designating, refining, and understanding values for myself. And also looking at the values that are constantly being programmed and pushed into me and other people around me, and how significantly that can derail a person from experiencing fulfillment. Because the goal of decisions is always to, in my sense, to further approach the experience of fulfillment, or in more classical terms, the approach the experience of eudaimonia, a term coined by Aristotle, um, or Socrates, one of the two.
So, what would you say are some of your defining values? How did you arrive at those? And then you mentioned something about how other people can try to influence your values in a way that makes it harder to find fulfillment.
Yeah, it seems like constantly there is a force outside of myself trying to install values into me such that I adopt those values consciously or unconsciously, and then contribute to the thing or the person or the societal structure or system pushing that value onto me. For example, the value to be, the value to have resources in society to purchase more things, or the value of consumerism is a value that our society upholds as something like, if you do this, then that equates to fulfillment, and that's the programming that I think is put into people. But the question that I ask is it actually fulfilling, or is it more like a cycle, an addictive cycle that has where you have an experience of craving, then you have a satisfaction of that craving only to be followed by more. Like, is it actually reaching? Are you approaching an experience of fulfillment, or are you just in this perpetual cycle of craving, and then the end of that craving cycle, and then the rebirth of it? And so that's one of the examples of the external values. But internally, approaching and arriving at the values that I found, like what you asked, what is one of my, how have I arrived at my values, or what are some of those values? I would say the highest value is something like truth and something like sincerity. And I think it's both of those things, because you don't get truth without sincerity. And you also um, can't get anywhere without the truth. I was almost going to say love, and I do think love is either first or second or third, or it's somewhere in, like, it's hard to really give a 1, 2, 3 list. Maybe there's something like, kind of like the Gankyo I have out here, that maybe it's something like they're all intertwined in this sort of like web, where if you take one out, the rest of it falls apart. So something like love, sincerity, and truth are somehow all like a very core, integral part of the things that I've determined are a core value of mine, and they express themselves differently in my personality, differently than they might express in your personality. But at a central point, those three things are probably, and I say probably because these things are always evolving, dynamic, but probably the most important things to me.
So there's two things that stood out to me there. One was that when you said, um, talking about consumerism, how you can acquire something and then eventually the sense of fulfillment fades and you have to reacquire new things. Do you think that doesn't apply to more stereotypically normal feelings like love? Like you can feel love for someone, especially early on in dating, but then eventually those sensations can fade over time. They need to be renewed, or friendship or compassion. Seems like the vast majority of human emotions follow that kind of trend of where it's can be very highly fulfilled for a certain amount of time, but then wanes over time. And the second thing that stood out to me was when you said you can't get anywhere without truth. And that's something I think I would fundamentally disagree with. I think that lies, useful fictions, are actually probably the majority of things that most people believe and act upon and are motivated by in the world. I think that's probably more productive than the truth in the vast majority of social contexts, which is only outdone by like science and technology, which is of course driven by truth. But I think when it comes to the human emotional element, falsehoods can be more motivating than the truth in many contexts.
Absolutely. So, regarding the first question, or the first point you made with the experience of something like a human emotion like love, I would say the difference between that and consumerism is that, well, first off, I think we would have to define what we're even talking about with regards to love, and maybe create a distinction between that, um, lust, and attachment. So, what's the distinction between love, lust, attachment, and um, basically those things? Like, a lot of the times, I find that what people experience at the beginning of a relationship is something like infatuation. They're experiencing their needs being met all of a sudden. They're experiencing gratification sexually and or intimately in a way that they hadn't before, and that releases oxytocin. That releases different neurochemicals that are associated with feeling very, very pleasant. The difference between that and what I would say love, when it's as a value that I have, is love isn't dependent on a neurochemical experience. It's not dependent on even a person in one's life to facilitate that, but it also can be triggered by that. And I think it uniquely is triggered by that often more often than it is triggered in an independent single experience, but it's not limited. And I would argue if a person experiences a high at the beginning of anything, friendship, relationship, any form of connection, and then that disappears, what they were experiencing wasn't the value of love that I'm designating. It was something akin to attachment, lust, infatuation, or their needs being met, and then all of a sudden their needs not being met. Love is something that is able to grow over time and isn't subject to what I would call um, falling away upon the object itself being seen differently. And that's a distinction I'm making. Like it's hard to really put into words, but it's part of the definitive quality of love. It's like it opens a part of a person in a way that allows that person more freedom in themselves. It doesn't create a higher level of dependency necessarily, even though dependency might be a part of that opening up in the immediate period. But the reason I put love as a core value is because what it does for a human being is it gives them more access to their inherent faculties to exist in a state of freedom, to exist free from internal barriers and internal constraints. And so in a partnership, I view partnership not as a tool simply to fulfill each other's needs and to create dependency, but as a tool to unlock within the individuals independently more and more access to their wholeness. And if that falls away and their wholeness falls away, then that wasn't accessing, they weren't unlocking the wholeness inside of one another. They were doing something else. Because when wholeness is unlocked, it's not dependent on something else, something outside of itself falling away. And I would say that's not something I necessarily like theorize. It's something that I've experienced. And so it's that form I think is not common, but that's the value, just to be clear of what I'm holding. It's like that's the form of love versus when attachment, fulfillment, releasing of these love chemicals are there. None of that's bad. It's just a different it's just a different type of value. And I would say that can be a value, and I think a lot of people hold that as a value, and I hold that as a value. Those experiences, but I think they're values that are subordinate to love, which is the intermutual unlocking of wholeness within. If it's in a partnership between two people, or if it's just independently, if you're by yourself, you're unlocking that for yourself, and that's love. That's self-love. But that's a form of love that can be shared with the world, and it's experienced in other people as also the unlocking of their faculties and their ability to experience more wholeness. That doesn't disintegrate or fade over time because wholeness is already their intrinsic nature, and there's only obstacles that are in the way between wholeness and the perception of wholeness.
Sure, I definitely like to touch on that because I don't think I'm a materialist physicalist. So I, of course, think love is a physical emotion just like anything else. But did you want to mention anything about my second point about how you said truth was the only way to achieve
Yes,
anything?
I just talked for so long. I wanted to let you respond, but I am going to get to that for sure. Do you want me to? Yeah, sure. So regarding you can, when I said you can't get anywhere without truth, I think I'd add the caveat of you can't get anywhere that leads you to um, I'll even phrase it this way: the best places you can get to are only accessible through truth. But you can get to a plethora of different places in society and high echelons of society through lies and deception. But I think where a person ultimately will feel and experience the most freedom, and I think in the values, I think I'd also put freedom because I'm kind of remembering like that's actually maybe the point of even all of these things like love, truth, um, is the point is freedom for an individual or more access to, we could even say the will, but we'll get to that. Um, when a person is following things that are untruthful, and truth being the definition of truth is just that's a whole topic, but for brevity, just what is the case, and also what works, like what is it that works. And the truth might be, if you want to enter, like, I'm not limiting the truth to just being like, you have to be 100% honest to every single person. Like, what if the truth is, in certain situations, if I want this child to experience joy and levity, the truth in the situation may be communicating to them that Santa Claus is, flying around, dropping presents. That truth, the truth of that is, it kind of transcends this sort of the idea of honesty. Like, there's an element of truth where truth is simply like, what are my values? And the truth is, what do I need to do to fulfill those values? Like, am I being honest about what is it that what I'm holding at my deepest level? And the truth is, I want love. And the truth is, if I'm going to be that brash with a child, they'll experience potentially a contraction. They'll experience sorrow, maybe these types of things. Um, but I do think honesty is absolutely seminal for a lot of things, and in most cases, if not the vast majority of cases, honesty is absolutely critical, especially inside.
All right, so my first question was about love. So the first thing that came to mind when you said that if love wanes, it's not the real kind of love that you're referring to, is that there are certain kinds of neurological conditions, specifically anhedonia, alexithymia, conditions where love can be shut off in the brain. And so you can have a man who loves his wife very deeply, probably with having all the qualities that I assume that you would attribute to the kind of real love that you're describing, but he becomes affected by a tumor or a bacteria, and that can cause him to have anhedonia and lose that sensation. Excuse me, I had to sneeze. Would you claim that that person didn't have real love if he was susceptible to the physical world and that cancer or some disease lost the ability to feel that love? Would you accuse him of never having had the kind of love that you're talking about?
No, no, because I don't believe love is dependent on the experience or feeling state of an emotion or a specific neurochemical concoction or cocktail in the mind and body. I don't think love is dependent on that. I think love exists independent of the experience in the body of joy and bliss and oxytocin being released. I think those are all beautiful correspondence to love in healthy bodies. And I think that's a gift from nature. And I think it's unfortunate. Maybe it's unfortunate. Maybe it's necessary. Maybe it's their karma. Maybe it's whatever. But I think it's an experience that's beautiful that I would want everyone to have. But I don't think love is dependent on that. And if that goes away, I think a person can still access love. Um, and love being the ability to understand and know oneself as whole and complete, and to then sort of outwardly express that towards those around them to sort of um, create that experience in others. It's almost like the result of love isn't necessarily that intensity, but I think one of the results that I might see as universal, and I'm kind of careful with this because I'm not sure if this is true, but I think it's something like there's not as much of an outward reaching for things to put inside of oneself to experience a higher degree of okayness with being here right now and existing right here right now, even if that experience right here right now is filled with pain and non-expression or non-emotionality. There can still be that experience of a groundedness and a non reaching out, like something out there is going to put something here that will make this experience more who I am, or more. Um, I'm not seeking outside of myself anymore. It's like I am myself, and whatever follows that, whatever experience is coming into whatever experience is um, on the screen of myself is no longer mistaken as another part of me that I have to somehow get and hold. I think that's the universal manifestation of love in conscious beings and potentially unconscious beings, but I can't speak on that subject
Well, so
because
why
I
call
don't.
that love? Because that sounds like self-confidence or self-acceptance in some sense, but I don't think it would resonate with what I understand love to be.
I
Because
think
to
it's the
me,
manifestation. Those are the manifestations of love. Love itself is distinct from that experience. The manifestation of love is self confidence. It's a secondary, like an epiphenomena of those are epiphenomena of love, or second causes to it. But the actual experience or actual reality of love is something that I think is very difficult to actually point to and speak about.
when I think of love, I think of the emotions associated with oxytocin that you mentioned earlier.
I think everybody does.
And so I don't understand why we would attribute this new idea of love that you've described as being fundamental or attributed to the word love. It seems like I would
I
use
can.
the words. Go ahead.
How would you use the word love?
I would use the word love to refer to an overwhelming emotion of warmth regarding another human being and having being in their presence and doing things for them and having a positive reaction to things that they do for you. I would use it as essentially just all the things that oxytocin does.
Yeah.
Um,
So I think that's a correspondent, a pretty. It's a correspondent or a correlate of love that I think is a common like it's a you can predict it in some cases, but I don't conflate it to what love actually is. And the reason I don't is because I perceive love as something that can act outside of the conditions of that experience. In fact, I think that's why when someone is experiencing um, almost exclusively in their experience pain and suffering, and they're not experiencing oxytocin, they're not experiencing joy, they're not experiencing happiness, but still are able to in those experiences say take care of a person who needs them, or and this is something that we can observe in people. And you might ask, like, why would somebody act towards another human being or an animal knowing that that action is not even coming from an experience of empathy, an experience of joy? And I would say hard to it's hard to understand, but I think that the reason is because they're experiencing a love that transcends the emotional state.
I would interpret
Like,
that as them experiencing the same kind of oxytocin response, just to a lesser degree. So I think that the only people who truly don't feel any love or oxytocin are usually people with ASD, psychopathy. David Wood would be an example, where he wouldn't do those things at all because he's simply incapable of feeling those emotions. But typical human who has either in past felt that way and it's become an intrinsic part of their personality that they do loving things, or still feels to some degree, just to a lesser degree, the same oxytocin release. That would be what I would interpret as them why they do selfless actions, loving actions. Is
so I would ask the question, if a person is experiencing none of the correlate neurochemical response or neurochemical expressions like oxytocin, dopamine, endorphins, if somehow you could measure that they're not experiencing any of those things, yet they're still acting in a way that it looks selfless, or looks like they're doing something for the benefit of another without any guarantee or expectation of something in return. How would you interpret that action?
that it was a trained part of their past life. So if I was trained as a child, Pavlov's dog, for example, to do a specific action because it gave me an emotional reward, then even if you take away the reward, I'll still do the action. And so even if someone is in a very depressed state or loses their ability to feel love or oxytocin, they can still act in a loving way if in the past they had those experiences and had ingrained in themselves the actions that those experiences inspired. They could still act on those in that way, even lacking the emotions. Just like Pavlov's dog, you don't have to. You can cause emotions or actions even without the corresponding whatever is causing them.
I think they would act similar to how they're acting prior. The question that I would have then is, I would see that a person who's acting similar to how they're acting before, I don't know, like, I wouldn't immediately assume that they've been trained to do that. Um, I think I would have to look into like what is the actual reason. And I think in a lot of the cases, the reason is because they acknowledge that there is something that's happening on the other side of their help happening. Like it's sort of like you're saying, oh, they're like a robot, and they couldn't help but not just do the robotic programming versus the consideration of life being um, almost like seeing oneself in the object that's being interacted with. And I think one of the elements of sort of love is that this is a perception that a person has of the things they're interacting with when they're serving it or when they're helping it or when they're doing something like that that's independent of their past, where they can see a part of themselves in the thing that they're interacting with, or they assume a part of themselves is in the thing they're interacting with. So independently of what they're experiencing, I think it's something like there's an element of identification with the thing that they're interacting with. So it's not because they were programmed to simply serve, it's that they see this sort of thing outside of themselves that they are preserving in the same way I might preserve my own life. If I'm threatened, if there's something that's potentially going to harm me, if I see that outside and I see that happening to something else, I can acknowledge like um, there's something there. There's just something like a consciousness there that serving or helping or doing something, it would uplift, like it would be of higher value for me to do that than simply not do something. Like there's an acknowledgement of the sort of, you could say, the sacredness or the value of consciousness itself integrated in love that is intrinsic to it. And it's
Sure, I'd
sort of
call
why
that
like
empathy. So I would agree that if you can feel empathy, then you would be able to do an action even though you don't feel anything in order to try to benefit someone else because of the mirror neurons in your brain, essentially. And I totally agree there. But I think like your earlier question regarding how would you tell if they were essentially trained to do it versus doing it because of the empathetic emotion, essentially. We could contrast that to someone who has ASD. And since they
can
lack
you just explain what ASD is?
antisocial disorder, psychopathy, um, they literally are incapable of feeling empathy. And so they don't do those actions simply because they can't feel empathy. And the biggest correlate evidentiary from an evidentiary perspective is when kids don't do those kinds of things until they get up until early childhood, like 3 or 4, when they're able to understand that there is another consciousness that they're interacting with. When they're able to understand that there's another person and they don't just see them as objects, which usually takes until you're 3 or 4. I think that was the age. And so before that, they don't do the same actions unless they're trained. And so I agree that there's multiple facets of why you do that. Either it's for the direct feeling of empathy that you feel, or the oxytocin response that you get emotionally. But I would consider both of those to be physical responses in the brain due to chemicals. I don't see this additional aspect of love, of something that transcends that. I see ideas and concepts related to those emotions that are derived from experiencing those emotions and chemicals. But I don't see that further thing that you're talking about, that there's something beyond just the physical aspect there.
I think you would have to entertain the idea that there is a element of awareness outside of the neurochemical processes happening in order to be on board with sort of my perspective of what love is. Because I don't think love is derived from, I think, so like, I think everything you're saying is, um, it's corollary. It's like, it's helpful. It's, it makes consciousness slash awareness, and I'm going to kind of interchange those two words. I know they're different in a lot of different schools of thought, but it makes awareness able to, in general, uh, be connective or be able to help others. But I don't think it's depend. I don't think it depends. I don't think one's helping of others or one's doing actions that are perceived from the outside are perceived as loving purely depends on those neurochemical elements. Because I believe awareness itself, the experience of consciousness in and of itself, there is an intrinsic quality to it that recognizes not only its own intrinsic um, value, like there's this is another value that I hold is consciousness. Like consciousness is maybe the highest value of them all. There's something about consciousness slash awareness, or this simply this ability to have cognizance of anything happening at all, where it's where empathy, it's the screen in which empathy or the experience of oxytocin or pleasure, it's the screen at which that experience comes to, and it's also the screen in which it falls away. So these experiences of pleasure, these experiences of empathy, these experiences of whatever experience you experience in love or relationship or in trauma, or they come into a space of awareness and they fall away and out of a space of awareness. And noticing, I notice in a lot of people, and I think also with how you're describing it, is the identification of love as these things that are it's dependent on these aspects that are coming and going. Like love is somehow one of the specific uh, coming and goings, whereas I think love is something that's a part of, like literally a part of the fabric of awareness, and it's blocked and it's interrupted. It's not focused on because awareness doesn't typically observe itself. It's usually focused in on a singular point. And so I'm saying love is more like the thing that detaches or takes awareness or consciousness and pushes it back into itself more, which naturally the manifestation of that is there's a higher level of freedom. So there's less of an identification with things outside, and there's a more of an identification with a space, or I don't even use the word space because space is a concept. There's no space. There's just awareness. Space comes into awareness. It's one of the comings and goings in awareness. It's a coming back into that sort of state of you could say emptiness, or emptiness is also a concept. So throw that out too. It's one of the comings and goings. It's a coming back into whatever there is that these comings and goings arise and fall in. And the love is that thing that is already there. And it's also the thing that brings a person outside, that pulls a person from the illusion of life, that this is who I am. I am this body. I'm this mind. I am this body. I am limited to this character. And it's also the thing that does that for everything around it. And when that happens more and more, its intrinsic value becomes cognizant, and it also becomes to cognize that everything is made of that, and the identification of the awareness is not somehow distinct from anything else, and it can observe the complexity of things outside of it, specifically organisms like yourself, as actually what it already. It's also, you are another manifestation of that awareness. So naturally, I identify with you, or I identify with whatever is giving you life. So I perceive and I want you to experience more freedom too, because I want myself to experience more freedom, whatever I am, and I can't point to it.
Well, so like the way you describe consciousness, it seems like that the love that you're describing would be intrinsic in any conscious awareness, whereas I don't think I would agree. I think that the way I think of consciousness is that there could be like a lizard is conscious, for example, but a lizard can't feel love. A lizard doesn't have the
It
cognitive
doesn't feel it.
capacity.
It doesn't feel it. It is it what gives it the ability to feel anything at all. Where feelings come and go is where I'm describing the fabric of love itself is like there. It's not like this intense experience of like inside of the body. It's already just it's where those intense experiences come and go. And it facilitates those intense experiences. It also facilitates terrible and awful experiences. It allows for those experiences to come, and there's not a it's not like picking which experience can be there and wait. It just it allows these experiences, all types of experiences.
I'm still lost of why you're calling that love. Because I mean, I'd just be like consciousness itself, I think would be the thing that fundamentally allows for all experiences. But I think that you can have
I
a
call it.
conscious, well, I think you can have a conscious experience that's like, say, a computer. The first time we make a computer conscious, I don't think it'll have any feelings or thoughts or introspection. I think it can have consciousness alone, just a thing that has a direct sense experience or direct quality experience with no emotional content whatsoever, no desires, no intentions, no motivations, no thoughts. And I would compare that to probably something like an early bacteria or early conscious, the first conscious mammals, essentially. But even those would probably still have some emotional content because of evolution. And so I think that consciousness would be fundamentally different from love. I think love would be more requiring a higher level of cognitive functionality than just being conscious. I don't think that just being conscious would be sufficient to give us that higher level kinds of feelings.
I don't think it would be. I think there's certain. So yeah, I think there's a certain level of complexity necessary for love to be able to be reflected on and to be acknowledged as something to be valued, even in the first place. Like an amoeba, I would say, is not experiencing its consciousness as love. But I think the reason consciousness is seeking the complexity, say, in human beings, like why do human beings exist? Why is there intelligence on planet Earth at all? Like, I think there's an answer to that, and I think the answer, and this is a very intuitive answer that is hard to justify based on evidence that we have in science, but I think it's something it helps this sort of tie together what I'm just describing here is because this complexity allows for reality itself to more and more directly reflect the importance or to understand itself and what it is, and to in more and more complex and deep ways to experience love that's already there and to appreciate or to be, you could say, I wanted to say be grateful, but it includes all the emotions. Like, and I really want to be careful with, I don't love the word love, no pun intended, because I don't think in 99% of the cases it's described as what I'm talking about. I think in 99% of the cases it's talked about as the coming and going emotions that are experienced, say, exclusively in romance or exclusively between a mother and child or exclusively in relationships between humans and animals or in just in humans and anything. And that emotional state is not what I'm describing as love. I'm describing love as the um, intrinsic quality of what gives a human being access to being able to experience it all. And I think all life is trying to deepen that awareness of that quality of consciousness And I think when consciousness reflects on itself, or when there's enough complexity or enough intelligence for a consciousness to reflect back on itself and see what it is. And I don't think this exists in animals. I don't think this exists in lizards. But I think it's the reason human beings are even here, and the reason complexity is even making sense. Our life is pushing itself in the direction of higher intelligence, despite the laws of thermodynamics seeming to suggest that things would diffuse and become less complex. I think, in spite of the reason that's happening, is because consciousness is trying to create a complex enough system so it can actually reflect on itself, such that it can experience itself, appreciate itself, and um, more and more free ways express itself in reality. And it's doing that because what it is, there's an intrinsic value in what it is. There's something there. And to describe what that is as love is it's kind of like a bastardization of like what it actually is that is happening here. And it's not an experience of whatever you're experiencing as a human to human connection, but it's facilitating that. Because I think yogis in the Himalayas are experiencing this times a million versus like some Disney princess and her, Prince Charming, because they somehow intuited, if I just focus on that, it'll expand, and it won't stop, and that becomes their practice, and that becomes the reason that um, they can even sustain themselves in these caves for years and years. But I don't think you have to do that. I just think they've chosen to do that because they are aware of this quality of consciousness that I might say should go unnamed, but is intrinsically one of the highest values. I'm calling it love, but maybe you could call it something else.
Sure. So, would a better word you to use be like just self-awareness or something along those lines to refer to the ability to introspect about your own consciousness and to try to gain a more comprehensive understanding of it, something along those lines? Because
I
yeah,
think
go
um, there's a Sanskrit term called Sat Chit Ananda, and it's three words to describe your intrinsic nature, or the intrinsic thing, or the intrinsic quality of what allows anything to be happening at all. It's three characteristics that are used to describe awareness. And Sat means existence. Chit means consciousness, and Ananda means bliss. And Ananda, or joy, is what I think I'm getting at here. It's like there's a bliss, but it's not like, oh, that means specifically my heart center is releasing oxytocin, or specifically I'm releasing oxytocin in this center in my brain. The bliss of consciousness itself is like the absence of disturbance. It's like an absence of this experience of desiring specific things in the world. It's like it's already just total. It's already a complete thing in itself. And when it turns in on itself and it reflects on itself, the experience of itself is to be described as like this. It's a state that transcends all states, and it's even hard to say it's preferable. It's just what is. And when consciousness goes into that, it knows there's a freedom. It knows there's this sort of, like, all of a sudden the things in life, the little emotions in life, even love itself, like the experience of like attachment or connection or dependency, all become these like little, like, um I don't know how to just waves, but the experience of that, it's like the value is infinite. And
So
but
a couple
it's
questions come to mind. One would be, suppose someone could achieve this state, um, but the more often they achieved it, let's say it faded for them. Would that disprove or make you doubt the idea that it was in fact fundamental or unchanging? And the second would be is, do you think that this sensation is necessarily the most powerful for everyone? Could it be the case that someone could experience this, but experience it differently than you? Like it's really not that impressive. I really like chocolate better, kind of a thing.
I don't think it would. I think I would have to. I think this is something that is a theory and a belief until it's experienced directly. Like, I wouldn't have a way of verifying what someone else is saying and experiencing. And I think it's not wise to hear someone's experience where they're saying, I had this experience of Satchit Ananda, I experienced bliss, and then it went away. Like, maybe that is true, but also there could be a number of interpretations that actually implies. It could imply they had a they had an actual experience that came to them and they felt it in their body. Maybe they felt it in their head. Maybe they um, had a specific expression of emotions that was very inspiring. But I would argue that if it's something if it's something that came to them and expressed itself in their bodies and minds as an experience, I would question if they are if their consciousness is absorbing into reality and a specific part of reality, or if it truly is reflected on itself. And I think that reflection on itself doesn't isn't a permanent state once it's achieved. I think it's something that can happen in a moment, and it's an undeniable experience in that moment because um, it simply is. I think it's something that it has to be experienced to understand what that even means. But I don't think consciousness, in absorbing into that experience, must stay in that experience. In fact, I think in the vast majority of cases, it is not able to be sustained, and a person comes back to the experience of the default absorption in their reality as a specific identity identified with the body, mind, emotional structure. In fact, I actually pretty confident that that's the case for almost everyone who has these many experiences. And in Zen, I think it's called a satori, or a partial opening to the experience of Satchit Ananda, or a partial enlightenment. But most experiences like that are partial, and some teachers that I've looked into, they will say you start with one opening, and then you have another, and then you have another that's a little bit shorter, or the distance between it is a little shorter. And usually it happens where you have them, and it's in the distance. It's the distance shortens and shortens and shortens until one day it doesn't ever go away. And Shinzen Young talks about that a little bit. I don't know if you're familiar with who this is, but he's a meditator that talks a lot with. He integrates a lot of ideas of neuroscience and spirituality, and he kind of merges the two to create this sort of uh, Eastern Western connection between like what's happening when a person experiences these deep states and what's actually happening in their brains. Um, and he describes that as he describes it often as a progressive coming into and going out, coming into, going out, and then there's like a reduction of that distance between them until it's like sustained. And that happened to him, I believe. I haven't gone super deep into Shinzen, but whatever's going on in Shinzen's mind is very interesting. And I think it's that absorption into the Satchit Ananda. And I think I would even maybe reframe my idea of love because I'm always evolving in my ideas. Maybe I would put the value as maybe something a little bit closer to Ananda, and one of the manifestations of Ananda is love. Is like this care, is this like when you come from a place of bliss and joy, you're not usually going to be an asshole to those around you, even when you're not experiencing the best thing in your body and mind. Because I think people are hurting others not because they're uh, in pain. I think it is because they're in pain, but I think it's because they're not aware of the state of their own inherent like freedom from the pain. Like
So
they're identified with the thing that's getting hurt.
what comes to mind for me is that I've had similar conversations though about with Christians where they say if you have the love of Jesus, it's the highest high you can ever have, and it never fades. And if it fades, it wasn't the true love of Jesus. You don't have the real Holy Spirit in you. And I would give them examples of the same thing, where as an atheist, many atheists have had religious experiences in the past, but they faded over time, or they lost them over time, or many people experienced them differently. And when talking to Christians who are very passionate about their beliefs, they will say, "Oh no, that wasn't the real Holy Spirit, because if it was, it wouldn't have faded." And I imagine from your perspective, I don't believe you're Christian. I think, unless you are, you can correct me. But I believe from your perspective, they just might be wrong. They have a very firm belief of their spirituality. And the truth is that there actually are a great diversity of ways that people experience belief in Jesus and the Holy Spirit. And it does fade. It's just a belief like any other. But from their perspective, there's no way I can prove that. They can always interpret it as in many different ways, like you mentioned, of saying, well, maybe it was not the real Holy Spirit, and it was just a feeling like any other, and they were just wrong. And that's a possibility. It's always possible that there are multiple explanations. It's just a fact of science. But is it that the most rational position to take? Should we believe that we have unlocked the fundamental nature of reality that is true for everyone, that there's this one feeling that is indomitable and is the true form of happiness, and that it applies to all humans? Or should we take the more humble position that we may have found that for ourselves, or found something that affects us in a very profound and meaningful way, and that it may not apply the same to everyone else? Maybe they do feel it differently. Maybe there are people who can go through the process you mentioned and achieve that high level state of shortening the process of getting to that high level state to the point where it just never goes away. But that could potentially fade too, because it's potentially a human emotion. Why would we prioritize the idea that it's fundamental to everyone rather than taking the more humble approach that it may be very powerful to me or to you, but maybe there are some differences to other humans? What makes you confident enough to say that this is truly the fundamental truth for everyone?
Yeah, so I think certain Christians have discovered a state of consciousness induced by such a level of devotion to some ideal or some pure form of their characterization of Jesus Christ that they experience on a regular basis in a very real and measurable way levels of love and peace and stability and groundedness that are comparatively high. Like I do believe that what they're experiencing is a genuine experience and an emotional state of stability. Is it
Oh, and I,
true?
I totally agree. I want to mention that I think
Yeah.
that.
Is it? Go
Go
ahead.
ahead. Yeah, I was just going to say that I agree that they have, that I would not deny the truth behind their claims of their experience and how powerful it is to them, just like I wouldn't deny the truth of the claims of the yogi or the that you mentioned. I think that he may have an extremely powerful, profound emotional experience, and I believe that you may have as well. The part that I think that I would disagree with is the extension you make from that you've experienced this extremely powerful emotion, and therefore it applies to everyone else. Everyone else, if they have experienced it but it fades, well, that's not the real emotion. Or if they experience it differently, that's not the real emotion. The part that I think is I would disagree with is that you apply this experience that you've had or your understanding to everyone else as if it works equally as well for them or applies equally as well for them
Okay.
in a
Yeah.
sense of objective truth.
Yeah. So the thing that I would, so to answer that first, there's two things I want to say. Um, I want to say what I disagree with. And I disagree with the idea that that experience can be co-opted by a school of thought, by a specific individual, by a specific religion. Like that's one thing I disagree with. Like the state of love or the state of experiencing this expansiveness of your mind or Christ consciousness is somehow limited to a specific man in time in a specific religion, I think that's arrogant. I think that's untruthful. I think that limits and is a constraint we put on reality, like that is not true. I think that state existed long before Jesus, and it will exist long after him. I think he discovered it, and he had followers follow him to it, who conflated him with the state itself, and conflate the religion with the only path to that state. But the fact that a religion was even able to be created in time, in space, that discovered that indicates to me that state was there prior to be discovered. It's almost like if I discover the law of gravity, or special relativity, it's like saying it's like worshiping the scientific method as if that's the thing to worship versus simply just using that equation or understanding that exists in nature and was there to be discovered in the first place. Thus, it's not dependent on the religion. And the second thing is, why would someone say this is a universal experience or somehow everyone's already experiencing that? The reason I would, the reason I might even suggest that this is something that's intrinsic to everybody, is not because people are just experiencing it and not aware of it. Which may let me rephrase it. I think that experience is approached not through an acquisition of something in the world, but through a letting go of what we have in ourselves as ourselves, or letting go of our attachment to specific parts of the world. So it's not an additive thing that induces the state. It's a it's a process that unfolds through a letting go of attachment to getting things, to having things, to a concept of what I am, to a concept of what you are, to a concept of what I want, or to letting go of what I want. And I think you can let go of what you want, or you can get what you want. And then when you get it, you realize that's not fulfilling, and then you let it go. So I think it's intrinsic. The idea that it's intrinsic to everyone stems from the idea that, oh, I arrived at this state not through somehow going somewhere, but letting myself fall back into what's already the natural state of myself, the natural consciousness that I am. And for me to assume that that natural consciousness is somehow just like unique to me and no one else has consciousness, I think would be a larger leap for me to make, larger solipsistic leap for me to make than to make the assumption that if you went through that process of letting go as well, what you would find in that would be similar to what I found or realized through that. And it's not an emotional state, it's an emotional state as a result of discovering the freedom from identity, the freedom from attachment, the freedom from desire. There's a corollary emotional state in a healthy physiology. If the physiology isn't healthy or working, it's still that experience of freedom or that recognition that these things out here in the world aren't myself. There'll still be a sort of freedom, but the corollary experience of joy, maybe they have a limiter on their physiology for emotions, and that's fine, like whatever. But that will still be a preferred, like there'll still be a preference for that. Like the love that a Christian experiences, I think, is still a secondary effect of their minds having let go of so many things that people are already holding on to that burden them, that limit them, that make them feel heavy. And I don't think it's limited to Christians. I think many people are experiencing this. I think people in other religions are experiencing this. I think agnostics experience this. I think certain atheists might even experience this. And when I left Christianity, one of the things I was sad about was like, and I hear this in a lot of atheists, they're like, I wish it was real. I wish the idea of God was real, but they're intellectually like unwilling to entertain something that's so ridiculous. Like I wish I could fall into that delusion because then I would just be happy. But oh no, I'm too smart to like, and I totally respect that. I think that's actually the right attitude to have. The only thing I think is limiting is that I think um, there's a truth that exists that doesn't demand you dilute yourself, believe in an illusion of that sort of state of letting go. Like you don't have to believe anything to see through um, the burden and the heaviness of holding on to things that are bringing the mind into a state of uh, like contraction, like not getting what you want, wanting something you don't have, being afraid of the specific of a specific form I'm in dissolving. Like when that goes away, in an atheist or a Christian or whatever, um, the corollary experience is an emotional levity. It's like an emotional experience um, of lightness, assuming their physiology is capable of doing that. If it's not, it's still a preferred state or perception, awareness versus the attachment to things that are not had, or um, to sort of these heavier contractions. And the very last thing I'll say is there's a man named Jeffrey Martin who did a research study on hundreds of individuals who claimed they were awake, enlightened, Christians, mystics, Muslims, a bunch of people, and he found there were four different locations that their consciousness he asked them to describe their state of consciousness. He is like, for 4 to 8 hours, each person he interviewed was 4 to 8 hours. Describe your state of consciousness. He found there were four distinct buckets that they fell into. And typically Christians who had their hearts open and were born again and were like, oh, you got to do Christianity, and reach the state of love and light. They fell into bucket three. But also, non Christians fell into bucket three. Jeffrey Martin said when
What are
his
the four
mom told,
buckets? So, like you said, there's four buckets. Like, what are the actual properties of the buckets?
yeah, so the four buckets are, let me just make sure I have this correct. Um, and there's a book on this that it's called The Finder's Course. Some people, I mean, I think it's a very interesting study. Like I try to take everything with a grain of salt, but it feels like one of the more grounded studies in this sort of world of like states of consciousness, or in the world of what Jeffrey Martin calls PNSE, or persistent non-symbolic experience. Persistent meaning it persists 24/7, 7 days a week. Non-symbolic meaning you can't pinpoint a specific emotion. Well, in some you can, but there's no symbol. There's not a concept. There's just the experience of it. There's not a concept that it's grounded in. It's just like you're experiencing something right now that's non-symbolic. Um, and yeah, non-symbolic experience. He calls it PNSE, and there's four types of PNSE that he describes. He found these self-claimed enlightened gurus or spiritualists would talk about. The first location, and he calls them four locations, not buckets. The first location is called the location of. Um, Let me actually 1 second. Are the four locations? Um, so I'll just describe it from my own understanding. I can't. Whatever. The first location is described as an individual who basically is just like relatively well, like 95% of the day. Their level relative to other people of joy, or or if you were to see them, they're just sort of like there's something about them where they're just experiencing this sort of levity or joy, or it's not a very like intense experience, but it's someone who's very, very grounded in a state of just stability and joy, levity. Um, The second state is non-dual, or the second location is non-dual, or not two. Not two is just in this state, the person's sense of self and their identity as an individual inside of their body has dissolved. They don't experience themselves as an individual part inside of this body, but they're experiencing themselves as distinct, as indistinct from the things, their sense doors, the sense door of vision, the sense door of experiencing the body as sensations, the sense door of smell and taste. It's all in a sense merged, and their identity isn't located at any particular point in that sense experience. Um, and what that does for the person or their consciousness is it frees them from the idea of self-concept as something limited in a specific way, in a specific body, with a specific conceptual story. It breaks that free. It breaks them free from that, and they experience a non-dual state. And that is the corollary emotions with that are very pleasant, are very unperturbed by their identity being threatened, which is the main reason people experience negative emotions, because their identity structure that they're identified with in their body or as their self concept as I am this, I am a lawyer, I am a husband, I am a son, I am this, I am black, I am white, I am a woman, I am man, I am a political this and political that. All that gets spread, their identity gets like taken out of those things, spread into all of the sense stores almost equally. And whenever those individual things are threatened, they might still defend themselves because it's true, but the correlation of the emotion when those things are threatened is no longer there because they're not convinced that they're actually those things. So the sense of threat and individual attack on themselves disappears. And so the second location is that non-dual sort of freedom, like they're freed from the concept of themselves as being an independent little node in their experience of reality that can somehow be destroyed. So that survival mechanism is sort of lifted. And so they're sort of, in a lot of cases, also have confronted this idea of death and dissolved it and not really as concerned about themselves dying because they've in a way already died, or the concept of death is, or the concept of something that could die is no longer really as entertained. I mean, the physical form is still going to protect itself. There's still fear, possibly. It's still only location two, so there's like two more to go.
Well, so what is it that all four of these locations have in common? That they achieve some kind of emotional state of um, calmness or joy in some
So
sense?
they're all related to the core. The common denominator between them all is that the person experiences it. It is a reduction of suffering.
So that's the four areas are all different ways that people have achieved a significant
I,
reduction of suffering. Would that be a
I'd
fair?
almost, yeah, I'd almost even say it's something like there's less friction. There's less friction between their consciousness and what's happening, like in their like maybe like more like I'd almost say like there's less suffering. Like I'm kind of like talking around it because it's hard to really describe what the exact thing is. They're coming closer to consciousness. They're entering less friction with life. They're experiencing more flow states. Their emotions are less limited in the idea that, or their emotions can more freely be like expressed without resistance. One other thing, I would say it's almost like the resistance a person experiences in their timeline throughout the day just starts to go down and it starts to approach zero. Where like I would say on average, the average individual going through the day, they're experiencing a lot of resistance to life, resistance to things happening. Like something might happen, their car might break, or they might get broken up with. They might even enter a new relationship, and there's always little things like where there's like this resistance that manifests in their experience as almost like like a heat or a discomfort or the sense of or like a suffering, like a maybe not even suffering is maybe like just like a dis-ease. Like there's like this subtle dis-ease with like life, like just how it is. Like there's a like it may like suffering is a term that's used in Buddhism a lot. What it really is just dis-ease. Um, like a little anxiety because something's not going well, or it's a little too cold, it's a little too hot. This I didn't get enough money here, or there's not enough whatever. That disease, each location is reducing. It's reducing slower and slower to a lower and lower level, closer to zero. Um, and ultimately, when that resistance is at zero, there is there is just a constant state or a persistent non-symbolic experience of what you might call um, I guess I don't know what you'd call it. You'd have to experience it because it's non-symbolic. Like what symbol can you use to describe what it is other than just an experience of flow, an experience of non-resistance, of lack of disease, not a lack of emotions that have negative valence to them. Negative valence being pain. Negative valence being if I put a knife in your shoulder, you're gonna experience something. That's gonna be a negative valence. If I give you MDMA, you're gonna experience a positive valence. But none of those things are somehow limiting the resistance to either of those experiences. And you can definitely resist positive valence, and you can definitely resist, and most people do, negative valence. That resistance element is removed. And now there's just this expression of these things in a very free way as you kind of can move along that timeline. And after that location two that I was describing as non-dual is where the Christians, and this is why I brought it up, is that the Christians experience this location three, and they experience is they start. It's interesting because the experiences kind of go in this like cycle, almost like this yin and yang. Like each location, like location two is non-dual, but location three you begin to identify again with the person, and location four you stop identifying with the character again. So it's like there's like a weird cycle, and there's locations past it too. Like there's five, six, whatever, but very rare. Um,
So the first thing that came to mind is when you were talking about how Christianity and no ideology has a singular hold on love or this positive emotion you're describing. And so it's wrong for them to attribute the only way to achieve true, sustained, whatever this emotion is via Jesus would just be ridiculous because you can't attribute a single cause to or single control over this feeling. But to me, it seems like you're in a way doing the same thing, saying that the way to achieve this is through the dissociation between needs and desires. And so I would say that the idea that dissociation is the one way, the one path to this emotion would be just as hierarchical as to say the one way is through Jesus or whatever. And the way I see it, I think that humanity is consciousness is very diverse, so diverse in that I believe that there are consciousnesses that could never achieve this for a number of reasons. One is just be it's physically impossible. Perfectly valid way to think about humans, the diversity of humans. I think it's in order to make the kinds of claims that you seem to be making, that it would apply to everyone, that everyone could experience this, that everyone could have this state, would require such an abundance of evidence that we don't have yet. Like as you mentioned, this
I don't
isn't
think
something.
everybody could. I don't think everybody could experience it if they just wanted to. I think a certain amount of people could based on their temperament and levels of discipline and devotion and sincerity in the direction to let go in this specific way.
Well, let me
Um,
clarify in one way. I think that given the methodology that you provided, the level of devotion and all of the other things you mentioned, if everyone did exactly that, I think that not everyone would achieve the state that you're describing. So I think that the methodology you're providing, even if done perfectly by all humans, would not lead to the same result. Similarly to Christianity, I don't think that if every human on planet Earth prayed to Jesus as genuinely and spiritually as possible, I don't think all of them would experience the love of Jesus, because I don't think it's like an actual spiritual thing in the universe. I think it's a chemical interaction in the brain.
Well, yeah, here's what I'll say. Like and this is I would categorize this as a belief. In the sense that I believe you exist in a similar way as I. Like, and I mean similar meaning you're experiencing something. I don't know what you're experiencing, but I assume you're experiencing something. I can't prove that with evidence. In fact, all I can prove with my own directness of my experience is that something's happening here. It helps me to assume that something's happening on your end for me to relate to you in a way that somehow represents to me as a meaningful interaction. But I could very well just be projecting onto you. Well, I actually am just projecting onto you the belief and assumption that you're a real thing that's having an experience of awareness. But I can't prove that. It's not knowledge. It's a belief. It's an assumption. I don't know that you're having an experience. And if I look into that enough, I can become so certain that you're just a representation in my mind that I'm projecting all of these attributes to that I believe you're having. Like you're aware, you have consciousness, but I don't know. It's not a certainty. It's not knowledge. Knowledge is not. I don't have knowledge you're having awareness. And so the reason I bring that up is because I think it's true that if I were to say everybody is going to experience these things if they do these practices, I don't know. Like maybe they won't. Maybe I don't even know if you are conscious right now. All I can say is that in my direct experience, letting go of certain things, especially things that relate to thinking something in the world, in my reality, will give me more than what I am, or give me some fulfillment. Letting go of these things or achieving them, like this is another thing. I think some things can be let go of, but I think other things need to be achieved in order to see that they actually just they're not going to like make this experience infinitely better. You just achieve something, and then now your mind's going to the next thing. So I like to think of you either have to see through it or see it through to let it go. And if you can see through it, and you can let it go right now, then do it. It's as good as getting it. If you can't, you must go into the world and achieve the thing, make the money, get the relationship, do whatever, so you can experience the lack of fulfillment it actually gives you, so you can then let it go. But I do think that that process of finding those things, those desires that exist inside, and in my experience, and feeling and creating this sort of more looseness, or letting these things sort of still exist. Like I'm not trying to throw these things away. Like I don't think there's anything wrong with trying really, really hard to do something in the world. I think that's actually very natural. And I don't think you should try to be, um, I don't think you should try to not have a desire. I don't think that's how it works either. I think there's a wisdom. And from that wisdom, you naturally sprout a letting go naturally occurs because you see that it's a preferred experience over clenching tightly. But in my own experience, all I can verify is that when I do that, it happens. And what falls away and what awareness falls back into is this sort of empty nothing. And for me to even assume you're aware, and this is why I brought that whole awareness. I don't know if you're aware, but if you are aware, I also assume your awareness is as empty as my awareness, is as contentless as mine, because I couldn't even fathom an awareness that isn't. Like I can't imagine there's a screen in which things are coming and going onto that is somehow intrinsically different than the very void, empty, absent quality of my own awareness. Like how could I can't even fathom it? But could that exist? Maybe. I mean, I can't tell you that I know that, but
Well, there's one
I'm
more thing.
it,
Could you imagine someone who went to this state of letting go, but experienced the same dissatisfaction as someone who achieves lots of money, and then it that fulfillment wanes and they need to obtain more money? So is it possible for someone to go through the state of dissociation, letting go, and just be dissatisfied. Just like, I don't. Does nothing for me. I'm bored. This is boring. Is that something that you can imagine?
I think if you have an expectation that this is going to lead you to something outside of yourself, I think you will. I think you'll be disappointed in the nothing you get. Like I think that happens actually kind of. I think that actually does happen, and I don't think it indicates to me that what they found at the end of their letting go is somehow um, bad or unsatisfying. I think it reveals to me that what they had thought they would get in their letting go is now coming up. Like if you still have that achievement mind, that what you're gonna get at the end of this process is gonna be like a ice cream cone, like a little you're open a box and you're gonna get like a little trinket because you did all this letting go and you reach the state of awakening. I think at the end, if you think that's gonna happen, what you will find is disappointment. But
Well,
that
I think that
disappointment,
seems to
but
put the blame on them a little bit. I want to go a little bit further and say, let's say they don't have any expectations whatsoever. Let's say they do all of the dissociation and they're just not satisfied with the sensation they're left with, the sensation of nothingness, the sensation of just being in alignment with who their consciousness fundamentally is, or having true introspection. Let's just say they're just like, this is not my thing. I'm just not, I don't like this. It's kind of boring. Not a fan. They didn't have any expectations. They didn't do anything wrong in the methodology. They're just like, this is just not my thing. Isn't is that a possibility that you see?
I think if they didn't have any expectations, I'd be curious. Um, I think it's possible for someone to have an attachment to something that they would prefer over not having the attachment. Like I think consciousness works in a way where for a person to want that, like I could like say if you gave so I think if you just like gave a random person the experience of this sort of freedom, I actually think a lot of people would say, screw that. I don't want that. I want to be attached to my family. I want to have this craving. I want to eat a potato chip, and when I'm not eating a potato chip, I want to feel that like excitement or that sort of experience of like craving to get that potato chip later tonight. I
Sure.
don't think, and I think one way I could say it is, I don't think a lot of people would be prepared for their minds wouldn't feel prepared for that experience, and it would create a lot of um, I think actually a lot of possibly terror in a mind itself, like the mind's response to it, the mind's response to that level of openness or that level of quote unquote freedom to have or not have anything and still remain in a state of contentment. The mind's response to that is uh, is fear, possibly, and terror, possibly, and like F this, F no, I'm going back into this illusion. I'm going back into this world of identity. I'm going back because why are we here anyway? Why are people in any way even identified? Like it serves a purpose. The survival mechanism. If you just do that, there are yogis who experience that and they just sit under a tree and die. I'm not saying that's everybody. I'm not saying that's every yogi. But for you to be attached to something in the world means you're here. Means that you don't want you still want to like do stuff, and I don't blame people for wanting to do stuff, and I'm not saying you have to sit under a tree and die if you are content all the time, but it means that that option becomes available to you. Possibly if you want to, then doing that wouldn't be like you're suffering so much and you're just going to end your life. It's just like whether I die, whether I don't die, it doesn't make a difference. So I do think a person's mind can prefer not to have that, but I don't think it invalidates the level of freedom and contentment of that state. I don't think it's for everybody, right? Like, I don't think it's for everybody. And I think because it's not for everybody, not everyone's like gung ho going to it. I think if everyone did that, or if I thought everyone should, I think that would reflect my own lack of awareness around the state. And I think it's like an acquired taste.
Yeah, that I would definitely agree with. So that would sound to me more with like what my perspective would be, which is that I think that meditation and dissociation can be extremely powerful for many people, but I don't think it's a solution that is a one size fits all. I don't think it applies to everybody. I think that most people wouldn't be satisfied with that, just like most people probably wouldn't be satisfied with Jesus. I think that it is a very useful tool
Yeah.
and can be very powerful, but I think it is just as individualistic as everything else. It can work for some, but not for
Yeah,
others.
I do too. And I also want to address the term disassociation because you are disassociating with specific things, but there is also an association process. There's a dissociation and there's association simultaneously happening. Like you have things like DID, you have dissociative identity disorder. And I think that's a dissociation process that happens without there being an associative process with something that's true. So you're left in this position where you're disassociated with reality, but you're not associated with yourself. You're like in a limbo. Like and it's usually a trauma response. You have this terrible experience, or maybe it's not terrible. Some meditators can end up here too, where you have this reality and you decide I'm going to dissociate with every little thing I can, and then you can enter the state of limbo between, say, reality, where you're just not identified with anything, but you still have yet to, I would say, discover the truth of your nature or your being. And without that associating with truth, like if you're not associating with truth while simultaneously disassociating with untruth, you're going to be left in a state that's maybe closer to DID. But if you're simultaneously associating with something that is with the truth, and I'll just leave it unnamed for now because it's hard to really name that. But if you're associating with that, you're having an experience of associating that's filling you with something. It's filling the experience with something, while simultaneously removing parts of that experience which pull you into like a more contracted or more dense form of, or pulls consciousness to identify with the densities or the things. And so I usually tell with people that are going into this process, like if you're simply avoiding everything in your life or dissociating and like pushing things away or whatever, like there's a possibility you'll end up in like sort of this little valley of like where you're just kind of like you don't really know like um let's just say it's not a fulfilling experience. But I think there is a step beyond that where all of a sudden you start to associate with this. You could almost call it. I'm just gonna like pull Nietzsche in and like just use his term of the will. You're almost like associating with this piece that's like a will. That's like you're gaining something while letting something go. Like it's an exchange. You're not just like you're not losing. You are losing everything, but you're also gaining like something like a power. Like you're gaining something that's more true than the thing you're letting go of. Like that's why I think the Buddha, I like how he phrases how it is when a person's like letting go of things. One of his disciples or followers had asked him, um, why would I let go of the world? Like, why would I let go of my pleasures? Why would I let go of this desire? Why would I do this? This is serving me. This is giving me pleasure. This is giving me, like, why would I restrain myself? And the way he would describe it is it's not like you're not just letting it go. You're trading it for something else. You're trading that desire. And he said it to his disciple in the way that I think the disciple needed, but I don't know if this is exactly true. It's like you're trading that desire or that attachment for something that gives you something more. Like it's not an equal trade. You're getting something higher. But in order to even understand that, there has to be a level of wisdom and maturity in the mind itself to even recognize that the thing that you're getting, the subtle thing that you're getting in return, is more fulfilling. And I
Well,
think that's a
that's the part I
training
think I would disagree
process.
with. The more fulfilling part, I think that's where I would still be like more fulfilling for you or more fulfilling for some people, but I wouldn't say it's inherently more fulfilling. I wouldn't say it's more
I would say
fulfilling for everyone.
more fulfilling for somebody whose interest is reducing their dis-ease and resistance. Like if they're just done with the entertainment of things. Like if they're just like, I want to stop suffering. I want the dis-ease, the experience of resistance to disappear. And that's not everyone. Some people love it. Some people are like, give me more of that. I love the chaos. I love this sort of people. Some people are addicted to drama. And if you put the idea of like, oh, you could have no drama, you could just sort of go to this sort of like more and more and more and more peaceful state. They even if you like somehow were able to take their brain and pull them in that direction, their brains would naturally resist it. And maybe that's not fulfilling to them. Maybe fulfillment is a soul or a spirit or just a mind, however you want to perceive it, satisfying what it is, what it believes it has to do. Like maybe fulfillment is just seeing, like I said, either you see through it or see it through. Maybe fulfillment is just seeing through all the things you have to see through, doing all the things you have to do to get the things that you think you need. And I think this is where my belief is that when you get those things that you think you need, in most cases, when you open a door, when you get the thing, what you find on the other side of it is not this sort of eternal, infinite fulfillment. It's just another door. You go into another door and you open another door and you open another door. And you always think the mind convinces itself, once I get to that door, once I climb that mountain, then I'm there. And then you do it, and then there's another mountain. And you do that, and there's another mountain. And I think that's what the human condition is. I think that's what I would say everybody experiences, but I don't think I would say everyone would benefit from stopping climbing mountains. I don't think everyone would see that as like, I don't think that'd be good for everybody to stop doing that, because um I think some people need to do the thing that their hearts and minds are calling them to do in this life, and that might include disease, entertaining disease, experiencing suffering, going through suffering, and then that fulfills them by showing them that the thing they got like is somehow, it sort of like unlocks part of themselves that they thought was blocked, or there's something that when you have a desire you limit how much you feel content. I still have to think about how I would even.
Well, so the way I like to think of it is like a video game. A video game, when I play on a very hard difficulty, is extremely challenging. There's lots of negative emotions. Throw my controller against the wall times. But I do it because fulfillment for me isn't in the negation of challenge. In many cases, it can be fighting through challenge to overcome it. And so I think fulfillment can be different for everyone. And I think that an additional thing I think I would add to what you described is that I think, and the reason I use the word dissociation is just a way to loosely try to describe your worldview from my perspective. So I'm not trying to make it a technical term that's perfectly exact. But when people go through that dissociative state that you're describing, I think that for many people could just be another hill, a temporary hill that they're going down. Like, okay, this was kind of useful for some time, but kind of got bored with it. And then they had to move on to the next hill. And so I think that your methodology of dissociation can be extremely helpful for people, and it can be a permanent help for many people. But for, I think, a lot of other people, it's just another hill that they're on. It's not going to be the final solution. And for a lot of people, it's not really what fulfillment is to them. I think that going through the challenges of video games, rather than dissociating, could be more fulfilling, or going through the challenges of life could be more fulfilling. Going through the ups and downs of the hills could be more fulfilling than having no suffering. And it could be the case that people who are in immense suffering, who have no chance to ever overcome that suffering, would be defeatist if they decided to, or feel defeatist if they decided to try to adopt a more dissociative worldview, because they said that would just be accepting the fact that life was so unfair to them, and they just have to like do the best they can, which happens to be this, rather
Well,
than
yeah,
continue
yeah.
on.
I think it would be dangerous to assume how that lack or that dissociation, how that dissociation process would manifest for every individual. I think for some people, like I had mentioned, that yogi or certain yogis, for some people, it might manifest for them as sitting under a tree and dying. And for other people, I think it might manifest as following through with taking care of their family, with taking their business to a new level, with doing athletics, with doing whatever they want. But I think a lot of that depends on their conditioning. And I think um, at the end of the day, suffering people just if someone says I want to suffer, I don't actually know if we are talking about the same thing. I don't know if my term is the same as theirs, because the term I'm using when I say suffering is something that fundamentally the mind would prefer not to experience. Like the very quality of suffering, the intrinsic within that thing, within that disease, is the mind's desire to not have that experience, be experienced. And for me, if someone says, I want my suffering, I want it served on me on a silver platter, um, I think the mind creates its suffering. So in some ways, the mind wants to create experiences where the necessary result is suffering. But I think what happens when a person starts to wisen up, as a person evolves, as a person learns, as a person sees the cause of what's leading directly to that suffering, I don't know if they would be able to, if they had the power to not eliminate it. And if they did not eliminate it, I would suggest um, there's like an addiction. Like we're all suffering. Like there's something. I guess what I'm trying to say is like suffering is a part of life. But as we grow, as we age, as we mature, spiritually, mentally, psychologically, what the natural consequence of maturity is and growing up is. And I think that's a term I like more than like spiritual evolution. It's just you're just growing up. You're just seeing when I do this thing, it's not going to get me what I want. And suffering going away is seeing what you want and knowing how to get it, and stop and ceasing the things that are doing you a disservice in getting where you want to go. Um,
When you say
and
that, I intuitively think of like, I think of what it would be like to be eternal, and I think of if I was an all powerful God or something. Would I eliminate all suffering? I would say probably not. I would probably experience, or choose to experience, probably the worst kinds of suffering. I would impose it on myself eventually, probably a very small percentage of the time, in order to learn from that experience. So I think any suffering that you could describe, that I don't think it's by definition, there's no way for the mind to want to experience that. I think it's an unpleasant experience. But there are times like where Christopher Hitchens was waterboarded. He would voluntarily wanted to go through the process of waterboarding it so he could empathize and understand with the prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. And obviously, waterboarding is not a pleasant experience. It's not something you want to or enjoy experiencing. But the choice to go through that suffering was valuable. It wasn't something he didn't want to do. He did want to do it because it helped him to learn something, to experience something that he hadn't before. And so I don't think suffering is inherently like as you get wiser, you don't want suffering. I can think of it as there are many reasons as you get wiser, you want to experience suffering. Though I would probably agree that just suffering forever to the maximum degree would probably just be insanity or something.
Yeah.
But there can
So
be
I
reasons to experience suffering or to want to experience suffering, like in video games, turning the difficulty to the hardest
no I
difficulty in Ninja Gaiden or whatever, Dark Souls.
Yeah. So I do agree that becoming wiser doesn't mean you don't want to suffer necessarily, but I think it means that you recognize suffering as something that can be um, sort of like as the crucible for evolution. And the reason one would even evolve in response to suffering is because it creates this pressure. Like as much as one matures, they recognize suffering as a pressure, not as like a not something to victimize themselves, but as something that's creating this pressure that's teaching them about um, ways they can exist different than how they were, such that that suffering pushes them closer to this idyllic state, like a perfected state. That's like theoretical, but like maybe where is the suffering pushing everything? Like what is it? What is it? It's a communication between reality and consciousness about directionality of um, the mind. And in evolution, it's the directionality to get things to. I don't even know what you'd call the whole intention of evolution, but it's a part. There's suffering that's intrinsic to the evolutionary process. Like if animals didn't suffer, it'd be hard for me to understand how there would be a survival mechanism at all in anything that would prevent them from that would encourage them to survive because it's suffering to get eaten, it's suffering to conceptualize even the idea of death. So there's some aspect of it like it's communicating and it's propelling reality in a specific direction. But I'm saying that the direction that it's heading, and I think there's four aspects of that, and I think I would call in like Ken Wilber's like four quadrant things. But the two quadrants that are relevant here are there's an internal evolution process happening, like a mental and psychological level of evolution, where the concepts you could think of concepts as or memes or societies, memes in society as these individual organisms that are going through this like evolutionary process, and then you have the external version of that in the world, which is much slower, but still an evolutionary process. And the suffering aspect in evolution, outside and inside, is pushing everything in a direction. Like there's a directionality to it. And the more mature someone comes, the more they become aware of suffering as this sort of thing that's pushing them in a direction. And the more you use that direction of suffering, the more you sort of like work with it, the more you see it as like, oh, this is integral. And I'm not trying to resist suffering. I'm not trying to eliminate suffering, but I'm working now with suffering to become where reality is already pushing this mind. And it's, instead of like saying, oh, we should get rid of suffering, the way you get rid of suffering is seeing where suffering is kind of like with the like listening carefully to the communication of what suffering is saying, becoming a very attentive listener, sensing it. And when you listen to it, you understand it, you notice where it's coming from, and you can evolve faster. And in that acceleration of evolution, internally, psychologically, you're not even getting rid of the suffering immediately, but you're just reinterpreting it as your teacher or like as some method, as something that's like kind of you just start working with it, and then naturally the suffering becomes more and more refined because as you work with it, the coarse versions of suffering become subtle, but the awareness of it becomes increased. In my experience, like the really coarse forms of suffering from like if I killed somebody, and then I lost my life, or I lost my ability to be free, and then all these intense emotions and all these intense feelings versus the subtle forms of suffering of um, just
Video
having this sort
games.
of sure video games, or like maybe I have a beautiful life, a beautiful family, but I am suffering because my child is is somehow not
Not
performing.
doing well in
He,
school. Doesn't get
he's
straight
getting
A's.
he's getting B's. He's not getting A's, and I want him to go here, but he's going here, or I don't know. But there's like a I think there's gradations, and the more refined suffering becomes, I don't think it appears in consciousness as somehow less intense. I think it's just the person you are, the evolution of who you are is more developed. But I think there is like this directionality to it that I'm like sort of trying to talk about. That's hard, but it's like you're getting on board with it and you're letting go of the things like that are causing it. But I don't think it's as easy as just like, oh, I'm going to let go. I'm just going to dissociate. I'm just going to like you actually have to listen to what it's communicating to you in order to not just simply bypass everything. And so what I'm really talking about is spiritual evolution. And spiritual evolution naturally leads to the direction of refinement of suffering. And the ultimate state is that suffering is so refined and so imperceptible that um, it's like thin. It's like this airy. But I don't think that ends this evolutionary process. I think there's still things you can do and evolve to. But I think if you transcend suffering, it means that you can now evolve without the pressure of suffering to push you forward. And I think the pressure of suffering, in a similar way, like if you're to try to get an animal to evolve, certain animals won't change unless you whip them. It's like, do you always need to be whipped super hard to change? Or eventually, could you psychologically develop yourself enough to recognize, like, oh, this would just be simply better if I did that? And if you evolve enough and you mature enough, I believe that that would eventually be something that would become accessible, but it's not accessible until we sort of go through this sort of process. I think that's one path. I think there's other paths um, where you refine yourself, but I I like that. I like that path. I like thinking that's like how this stuff is going.
Sure. I don't think I think of it as a directionality. I think that's where there's a difference because I think that you can evolve and grow spiritually in any direction. And I don't think any direction is necessarily bad or good. Um, I think that you could say, if we could live forever and live infinitely many lives, you could probably choose to evolve by living through a really terrible person's life who did lots of horrible things. Now, of course, I would want to put this in the context of my best of all possible worlds, where it was just like you on your own doing these terrible things and no one else was affected. It just was your perception that you were hurting other people or something. But I think that you would be able to develop and learn from living horribly bad lives and that you're a bad person or that you experience traumas as long as they were consensual and think that would be totally fine. So I don't see the directionality. I think directionality is usually constrained by limitations of what we have to do to live in this horrible world. And so the directionality is trying to, as you mentioned, put less tension between the way we live and the world we live in, because that's one of the primary causes of suffering for humans, is that the way that you are is in conflict with the way the world is, and the world tends to break you because it's a lot stronger than you are. But I
Well,
don't think that's a good thing. I think that's a bad thing, actually.
what's a bad thing?
That we have to try to live in harmony with the way the world is. I think the world is immoral, as we discussed before. I think the world is horrible, and I think that we have to. The fact that we have to change or align ourselves with the truth of the world is an immoral fact. Like one of the ways is that's affected me
What do you mean
recently.
by do you mean the world is in the human world, or like just
No,
nature itself,
both.
like reality?
Yes. So one of the ways that's affected me recently is um, getting dates. One of the most attractive features in a man is confidence, and I do not have the confidence to like go up and talk to women who I find attractive. I'm terrified of it from lots of personal trauma stuff. And the fact that I have to overcome that and change who I am in order to meet the evolutionary expectations of confidence, because it's attractive because it's evolutionarily advantageous, is something that I find horribly immoral. It's not trying to change myself and to accommodate nature, to be in alignment with nature, I think is immoral. I shouldn't have to do that. I think it's bad that you don't have the option of living in a world that can be accommodating to you. And so I think that this goal of living in alignment with the world is pragmatic, but not moral. It's not an ideal. It's not good to have to live in alignment with the world. It's just useful to try to make things less painful.
So do you think that do you think it would be good if the world sort of bent to you and what you needed? Like if you had to, if you were just yourself. And I understand that like these like dating worlds is really messed up nowadays. And maybe it was always that way. And maybe we're just a little bit more that way today, but I think it's always been like there's the select few men with access to many, many more options. And then there's the majority or whatever where they just kind of their evolution, the end of their timeline is just like that's just nature. My question is, do you think that process is would be better if it somehow tailored itself to your specific traits and characteristics?
Yes. So, well, not to me specifically, but yeah. So it'd be like to take a more easy to understand example, people who can't walk or people who are severely depressed. Back hundreds of years ago, they would essentially just die. They couldn't survive. They'd just be killed because people didn't have the means or resources to support them. The slow and the old would be killed by the predators. Nature would just kill them off. And today, we provide wheelchairs and entrance ramps so people can get into buildings, and healthcare and food and medicine for people who are depressed. We are fighting against nature to make reality bearable and functionable for those people in ways that align with who they are, rather than trying to make them
Well,
change who they are to
here's
accommodate
yeah,
nature.
here's how I could interpret this situation in a way that um, might justify the way reality is in some not silver lining way, but like maybe just like the reason it is this way. Like I don't necessarily think it's like an arbitrary suffering machine, like a lot of atheists might say, like, oh, this is just here just arbitrarily and we're just in the suffering machine. Like that's all it is.
Yeah.
And I think that that perspective is actually caustic. I think it's actually I think it takes the spirit or the whatever there is here that could evolve and it makes it justify its its resentment and hatred for the way things are. Like it's like this perspective that I think has almost no upside except in that it makes one feel like they've understood the truth and like there's a righteousness about like well I'm this is the truth and I understand it. As long as like even though the truth is hard, it's like I'm accepting the hard truth. This is just how it is. Like I'll see this a lot in like black pill or red pill ideology with men, specifically where they look at like the biological markers of attractiveness, and they'll see the men that are the chads that are like just getting all the girls and I've looked into this stuff and I understand that like you have these like facial qualities. You have the what is it, the tilt in the eyes and like whatever these qualities,
The
and
chins,
certain
the
men just
big
have
chins, chiseled jaw.
some guys are born with biological lottery ticket and they just whatever. And then you got guys that understand like social dynamics and they're confident and they just like basically just have like these exploits for like physiology, biology, and they can just like go into a bar, go into any environment, basically have success with a majority of it. But I don't think the perspective that that is somehow like like this immoral machine or the suffering machine. I think that perspective is one perspective that a person has the choice to pick, and in picking that perspective, it has a very real effect on their capacity to change their reality. Because I think that this imbalance that's created in biology, its purpose isn't to just mess with people. It's to take a person from a state of like if I'm not confident and I want something that requires confidence, um, I'm here and I want to be here. I can adopt that perspective that it's unfair. But what's that going to do for me? It's going to keep me here. I think the reason that this displacement exists is for the will of this character to somehow learn that there's something that can be done in spite of the current scenario. Like, in other words, like these challenges are presented to people, to things, not to create victims, not to just churn out suffering, and for Mara, the great evil being, to just slurp up the suffering of all these beings because she's so hungry for more meal for the slaughter. I think it's there because one can transcend the experience that they're in, but that transcendence of that experience is confined to their capacity to see that as a possibility. Um, like, um, I don't perceive any man as completely hopeless, specifically in dating, because we're using this example. I don't perceive any man as completely hopeless insofar unless he believes that to be. And the reason I believe that is because I've seen plenty of men that are awfully unattractive, have physical disabilities, who have XYZ, they don't have the anything, but there's a purity, there's a dedication, there's a sincerity, and there's a wholeness that necessarily pulls in opportunities for them that wouldn't come to them if they simply accepted their lot in life and they listened to the voice of the limited red pill. Like, this is my life. I've met so many. I used to talk to so many of these guys, and I personally have a lot of experience with these types of mentalities, and they're toxic. They burn away the possibility for the will to power. And I think one of the most attractive things is that will to power, is that ability to, in spite of feeling this sort of lack of fairness, to desire or to design your life to build whatever qualities you know are necessary to get what you want. That like and just sort of like throwing away our ideas of like this is a curse or this is immoral, and just seeing like what is it I want. And then I think in moving towards that and transcending the limitations and getting it, the perspective of the world being immoral turns into this perspective of the world being unfair, uh, but uh, uh, unfair, but overcomable.
Well,
But
I
I think that's
agree.
limited to specific people who do that process, and I don't think it's the majority.
Well, sure, I think I would agree, but that's where I mentioned that it's pragmatic to align yourself with nature. It is the best way to minimize your pain is to align yourself with nature. And so I would agree with everything you said in that um, adopting a perspective that helps you to align yourself with nature will be more likely to produce a fulfilling result while you're in nature. And I think that that is immoral. I think it's true, but it's immoral. It is wrong that you have to adopt a worldview or adopt a personality type or adopt specific traits because that's what the world likes, because it may be completely contrary to the who you are as a person. It may be completely contrary to your nature. And the fact that you have to completely change your nature or fight against your nature, and that some people just have the right nature to start with and are just extremely successful. I
I
think
don't
it's
know if I don't know if I would agree that like I don't like so like I think that in the align like so if we're talking about like confidence, for example, um, I don't only think you would be more, or just in general, men would experience more attractiveness from female counterparts from being confident. I think they would also personally experience a benefit to that too. And I'm not saying that confidence is something that like you could a lot of people fake confidence and that gets them the result. But I'm not talking about that. And that's like an exploit. Like that you could say that's like a hack. But I think that hack comes with a consequence of equal proportion to the lie and the deception of it, which is a person who fakes confidence will get what they want initially, but over time that will begin to deflate, or what was created, or the perception of the woman that liked that person. They will eventually see through it because they have to, because it wasn't real to begin with,
oh,
or it will
I
lead that,
I
or
don't want to derail the conversation, but I totally disagree because I think you can fake confidence, then achieve something, and then have real confidence as a result. But I keep going.
I think that's one pathway, but it would require for the person to reflect on. Um, it depends on what the confidence is about. Like if the confidence is about I can talk to people and be safe, then sure. If the confidence is about I am a good electrician, um, but I think you make a good point. It's just if you're using the confidence without there being anything, um,
That you can learn or gain from that confidence. So if you're just
because
using it,
I actually agree. Like you can fake things until you make it. Like you can create, and I think this actually is a good point because it touches on reality creation. Like if I want a reality, I can sort of envision myself as this character, pretend to be it, or pretend or just be it, just kind of be it, and then I'm entraining that conditioned pattern inside of myself. And so there's a reality to that. Yes, I guess what I'm trying to say is, if I'm deceiving somebody in a way that is not just about like personal, like being just totally feeling safe or feeling totally just like you're engaged, like expressing my personality. Um, there's certain consequences to fake confidence. Like real confidence comes from an experience, like comes over time from experience of security around a specific thing. And if I'm secure in myself, that confidence is pretty natural. Um, and if I'm not secure in myself, there is this sort of faking it until I learn the safety. Um, and so I think I actually probably going to think about this a little bit more because there's a little paradox here that I haven't fully. But I think at the end of the day, I'm trying to just say like, um, if you're deceptive about your intentions in hopes that that deception somehow, um, like if you're saying I think what I'm really trying to say is if I'm saying I have like $5,000 in my bank account and I'm using that to build like the sense of confidence, there's some piece that's a displacement where if you don't, there's likely going to be a falling out. Like, I don't know how to exactly phrase that in a way, but like there's always a consequence, or there's a potential to, when you're deceiving someone, for that deception to be deflated because there's nothing inside of it.
I
It's like
wish that was true, but Donald Trump literally did that when he inflated the prices of his buildings in order to get loans from the bank, and the Supreme Court has ruled that he literally can't be punished for that now because he's president. But I wish that were true. But
there's a consequence. There's a consequence to it, though. There's a consequence to it. I'm saying there's a consequence. Like, there's people that see that and don't trust him, and there's people that see that and do trust him. Like, if there was complete integrity in that, like if he actually didn't do that in some way, he got to where he was without doing that, which is a very big question of if he could. I think uh, there would be like a substance about that scenario that wouldn't result in the amount of hatred towards him, and the amount of deceit, or the amount of, like, I don't think there's anyone more hated in the world than Donald Trump. And that's like the proportionate, that's the result of the deception. Like, some people aren't, like, they want him, they literally want to kill him. And I think that's the result.
sure,
And I think
sure.
that's a real consequence. But I think another consequence is some people are deceived by it. And I could go out and pretend I have a Lambo and I have all this money. And that would attract a certain type of person. There would be a result that I give. I would be like, oh, I got this and this is how I did it. And like, I would be happy about it or whatever. But there would be a certain aspect where there's like a proportionate negative effect of people hating me. And I don't think the world is wise enough to know the difference. I think the world is fairly seduced by lies and deception, as I think people are kind of animalistic and live in their, a lot of times, in their lower desires, and they want to believe these things more than they want to know the truth. I don't think truth drives people, so I think the deception will actually get people far in the world, maybe more far than being completely honest. In this specific world, it'll get them further in the world, but I don't think it'll get them further in their soul's development. And I don't think anything other than that is worthwhile to do. And if you do find it worthwhile to do that, I think it's a matter of time before you recognize that in doing what you had done to get what you got in the world, you simultaneously lost something of indirect experience of higher value.
Ooh,
And the
I
thing that,
might disagree there because I think that, like we were mentioning earlier, that fulfillment can be different for different people, and that some people, fulfillment for them may be the acquisition of material or power through the means of deception over spiritual development. And to them, that
well,
could genuinely
yeah,
be more fulfilling to them than
I
pursuing
think they,
spiritual development.
I think they would believe it's more fulfilling to them. I don't think I would disagree with that. If you ask them, would you rather have all the money you've made, or somehow have what this weird yogi dude has in the Himalayas? I think they would 100% of the time say like, oh, I would rather have a billion, million, XYZ. But I don't think that belief, to me, justifies the fact that their fulfillment is higher than that yogi's. Like, I don't think it justifies to me. And the reason it doesn't is because the thing that I'm saying they're simultaneously losing and what they're gaining is actually, like, they're fulfilling a desire. They are getting something in return. There is a fulfillment there. It's a real fulfillment. Um, but there's also the conviction. What they're getting is also the conviction that this thing that I got, this money that I got, this is they're convinced that that fills their experience. Like, how do I say it?
Well, I would say that I think that just as they would be unjustified to claim that the yogi's fulfillment was less than, I think that you would also be unjustified to claim that their fulfillment would be less than the yogi. I think that they could get potentially just as much fulfillment, a maximization of whatever their personal fulfillment is, from that methodology of deception to gain power, essentially,
Well,
just as much as the
go ahead.
yogi could gain fulfillment from his dissociation. I think that fulfillment for each individual, it can be very, very different because everyone is different. And I think that
Well, here's what I'll say is like if you flip the lives of those two individuals, the yogi would experience just as much fulfillment having these things, and he'd probably do something different. He'd probably just give it all away. But the fact that he received or got these things wouldn't take away his fulfillment. Whereas if you took these things away from those who've attained the world, their fulfillment would go with those things because it was based on those things. And their acquisition of those things was based on their idea that they would bring the fulfillment to them. And so
while
from
that
that,
might be true, why would that make their fulfillment less
I would
lesser
say it's
than? Because I
I would
think
say
that
it's
I,
lesser just because the fact that it's less stable and it depends on something that is not able to be intrinsic to their nature. Like if your fulfillment comes outside of you versus if it comes from an intrinsic part of you, then that will always be not only outside and potentially able to be taken away, but also there's going to be a part of your mind that knows, either consciously or unconsciously, that this thing here, I have to protect it because if I lose it, I lose my fulfillment. And so there's an anxiety around it. Versus the yogi, he doesn't have any anxiety around it because what he is in himself is the very source of that fulfillment. And so maybe
well,
the direct
remember when we were
experience.
talking earlier that sometimes people could prefer the like a video game, you could prefer the tension, you could prefer the anxiety, and that could be more fulfilling for an individual. So I don't think that the fear of loss or the needing to protect something could actually be a hors d'oeuvre or a spice of life that could actually add more value to someone's life. And I don't think it's
Well,
fair.
they do prefer the anxiety because that anxiety depends on their fulfilling their protective process. Like of course they prefer the anxiety. Of course they prefer the fear because they need the thing that they need the anxiety to encourage them to protect the thing that their fulfillment comes from. And
I would
so
disagree because I think like in a video
they don't
game,
prefer the
I could
anxiety itself. They don't
I think they
the
do.
thing
I think they do. So like in a video game, I could turn on invincibility and I could just walk through and just beat every video game without doing anything, but I'd be bored. So I literally prefer the anxiety of playing on a really hard difficulty, knowing that I could get crushed in any second in a one-hit move because the experience is more fulfilling to me with the anxiety than without the anxiety. And so I think there are times where you can literally prefer having anxiety because it makes things more fulfilling. And so I think that a person who prefers money or power or whatever may enjoy the competition of maintaining that money or power, and it may be something that they relish, they value, that they would lose something if they didn't have. And so it could be a positive. And so I think, the other thing I wanted to mention is the fact that the yogi may be able to be fulfilled in a more diverse set of life circumstances. I don't think that makes the yogi's fulfillment any more true or justified or valid than anyone else's. I don't think that you should assess true fulfillment by virtue of the amount of times or spaces you could be fulfilled. I think that even if it's incredibly rare or that you feel fulfilled, that type of fulfillment isn't any less true or valid than one that's you can be fulfilled all the
even
time. It's just more pragmatic. It's clearly more
yeah,
pragmatic.
I hear what you're saying. Like I hear that even if their level of fulfillment say is like one or like they're the same level, um, I would disagree that the fact that that fulfillment being experienced in more diverse contexts would mean it's somehow. I would disagree that that's somehow irrelevant to the question of which fulfillment is higher, and
How
higher
so?
not in the sense that it's not in the sense that it. I actually do think it's deeper, but let's forget it. Let's say it's the same level. Let's say that
Yeah.
the experience is the same level. Even if it's the same level, it's higher because it's broader. And I think a broader degree of fulfillment, um, like I think that's what the wealthy person is already trying to do, is they're trying to broaden their fulfillment through acquiring more wealth. Like there's a process unfolding as they're getting that money, and it's not to sustain that level of fulfillment. I think it's like trying to broaden the current level of fulfillment to more context, for more areas to be, like for them to be unpet, like their little shelter of fulfillment to be infinitely protected. I think there's a fear that drives a lot of these a lot of these people, and now they're trying to essentially live forever, because there's this idea that now that I have the world, and they realize if I died, I would lose it all. So they're going to try to then protect their human vessel. So they're trying to broaden the context in which they experience that fulfillment, because they recognize there's the context in which they won't experience that fulfillment, and that's on their deathbed.
Well, I think some people are affected by fear in that way, and that fear is their primary motivation, that they're doing trying to get control over things in order to accommodate fear. But that's the vast, vast minority. There was a study done by oh, Dan something or another, where it was measuring the amount of money you had relative to your happiness, and it showed that the vast majority of people, once you got over $50,000, was equivalently happy. It didn't really make that much of a difference. Below 50,000, getting more money made you significantly more happy. Above 50,000 was kind of like meh. But they did a follow-up study, and they
Yeah.
showed that the tens of millions to the hundreds of millions to the billionaires actually were made happier by getting more money, because it was a social status thing in their friend groups. They were more competitive. It was fun. It was like playing a video game, getting the rarest Pokemon card, getting the highest achievement. And so for those people, getting more money did improve their happiness, because it's a friend group thing. It's a competitive thing. It's a video game essentially to them. um and so I think that you have a very particular interpretation of human emotion and fulfillment that is very positive and very heartwarming. But I would disagree. I think that the world is far more diverse than that, and that deception and lies and materialism and competition and experiencing suffering, all of those things are spices of life that can make fulfilling lives just as much so as detachment, for some
And
people, not obviously
so
not everyone.
sure. And I guess I would say I'm not excluding the acquisition of things in the world from the idea that fulfillment can be achieved at the level of that yogi, but still be pursuing the spices of life. I think it's not exclusive to the yogi. I'm not saying that.
Oh yeah, for
I'm
sure.
saying I'm saying that yogi could still be in the world pursuing creating these sort of, you know, businesses or acquiring like large amounts of wealth, where if it went away, there wouldn't be that dissolving of their fulfillment. And I'm saying the person who's able to have the world, get all these things, the yogi who can, or this, the person, let's not call him a yogi, who cares? The guy or the woman who's able to get the wealth and lose all of it and not simultaneously want to die or feel this depression like during the 1920s, during the Great Depression. That a lot of people, and even recently with Bitcoin, and people are killing themselves and had killed themselves when they lost their wealth. I'm saying that person who kills themselves, who loses all of their experience of joy and bliss or whatever as a result of losing the things that they've gained in the world, versus someone who loses all those things and says, "Oh, great, we get to play the game again." I think that person who has the attitude that's like light and not like holding these things in such a way that their life depends on it, I'm calling that person more fulfilled, or their fulfillment is higher, more intrinsic. Is somehow there's like there's a hierarchy. There's a higher, like I'm creating this sort of hierarchy of fulfillment, and I think that a person, as their spirit evolves, or as they evolve, as they grow up in the world as a human being, that they begin to recognize that this is a video game, and if I'm taking it so seriously that I'm going to kill myself, or I'm going to become this sort of ineffective, depressed person that doesn't even like can't experience joy or is just lost as a result of losing these things. I think that person is less spiritually mature and thus less able to experience a level of fulfillment than a person who's strictly acting from um, or a person who's able to go up and down and lose things in the world and still have that feeling of wholeness. Because I don't think a person pursuing the world is intrinsically not fulfilled because they're pursuing things in the world. You can do whatever you want, but whether it's in the world or in a cave, your degree of fulfillment is depending. Your degree of fulfillment will grow the more you grow up, and what you decide to do with that, I think depends on the individual person. There, you don't have to be in a cave. You don't have to build $1 billion business. You could be in a farm, or you could I don't know, just have a family and a normal life and experience levels of fulfillment that are at all the levels that we described. But I think it's a dependent on the spiritual maturity of that person,
Oh
if we
yeah,
can use
totally.
that term,
I would definitely agree that having a broader sense of
or
what
more
makes you fulfilled.
stable.
Yeah, more stable. That works very well. Like a more stable sense of fulfillment can be safer, but I don't think everyone can have that. Like I mentioned, I think that people who can try the dissociation yogi method and just be like, oh, it doesn't do anything for me. And there are people who,
Well, maybe go ahead. Well, maybe everyone can't have it, but I think the result or the epiphenomena of spiritual growth or growing up is a stability in that fulfillment. The result of learning from one's suffering results in a stability of, you could call it fulfillment, you could call it a stability just in your just presence and your relationship with reality, where your expectations stop becoming the source of pain, or your unfulfilled expectations stop becoming this source of you losing yourself, you losing this like stability in yourself. And I think like I think it's a very also a very intrinsic part of the masculine as it becomes more and more um, you could say just embodying of that sort of quality of the masculine. One of the things how it represents is a stability in the face of losing things, in the face of gaining things. It's just solid, and it doesn't oscillate. It doesn't oscillate. It just is this force of is sort of like just a force of nature that is gaining its fulfillment through simply expressing itself and doing what it's called to. And I think that's the level of freedom that we all would would want. I say that
I
carefully
don't
because
think so. Because I think the way I think about it is, suppose that my level of fulfillment was associated with something extremely common like air, oxygen. Suppose as long as I had oxygen, I was emotionally fulfilled, like the yogi, in a sense that I could be transferred into any situation, still be fulfillment, so long as I had oxygen. Now, this is an external thing, but it's just extremely common. All humans pretty much have it, unless you're in a cave or underwater or something. And so my fulfillment would be extremely secure in that the vast majority of human situations, I would be fulfilled. But is that desirable? Is that preferable to say, what I really want is, say, a person who genuinely loves and cares about me for who I am with no exceptions for my life? Now, that's an extremely rare thing. That is not a common thing to find. It's an extremely rare thing. But would I prefer having fulfillment from air because it's common, simply because it's common, rather than having fulfillment from a true love? I would say no. I wouldn't say that simply because something is common and more sustainable and more pragmatic, that it is more full or more deep, I think is the word you used, than one that is of something that's extremely rare. Because that extremely rare thing, I would say, of a true love would be more intrinsically valuable than oxygen. I don't think oxygen necessarily has any intrinsic value to it. And so I don't think that the rarity matters to the deepness of the level of fulfillment. I think it's pragmatic. I think it's very pragmatic that if you have lots of opportunities or something that's simple that gives you fulfillment, that you will have a very stable fulfillment and not as much suffering, which I think is a good thing. I think that's definitely preferable in many cases, but I don't think it's intrinsically preferable. I think that it's perfectly rational to be like, nah, I don't really want to be fulfilled by air. What I really want to be fulfilled by is true love. And I know that it's extremely rare and takes a lot of work, but I would be more fulfilled pursuing that than adopt a worldview or adopt a personality where I would be fulfilled by oxygen. Because what is more important to me than the level of security of my fulfillment is the depth to which I value this particular thing. And that to me outweighs the security of fulfillment I would gain from adopting a more prevalent source. And of course, having the source be within yourself would be more prevalent than oxygen. But either way, I think that the level of prevalence of what gives you fulfillment isn't necessarily the most important thing when deciding, or if even you may not even have a
Well,
choice when it gives you fulfillment.
yeah, independent of what this thing, the source outside of you is, what I hear is you're basically just creating a distinction between like stability and depth of
Yeah.
fulfillment, and you're saying this is preferred because there's a depth to it that I don't interpret is possible with this thing, and the depth is
Subjective.
dependent.
So it would
Well,
be
it's
subjective on the
subjective,
individual.
and you're basically saying this individual has a subjective perception or belief or whatever. Maybe they're even physiology and biological conditioning necessitates the complexity of that individual to fulfill the different values and things that it has inside of itself, versus air. But I think the issue is that air is not the same as one's intrinsic nature. And I don't think oxygen, like I think that's what you're trying to like compare that to. Is I'm intuiting like you're comparing air to something like what I was describing as a yogi or someone who's experiencing themselves
Well,
in
that's
a
not the
way where
core of the analogy, because the core of the analogy isn't the particular thing, whether it's air or the intrinsic nature within yourself. I think that the particular thing is subjective. So if I see dissociation and internal reflection as equivalently deep as air, so it's just not important to me. It's kind of like I've experienced it. It's kind of mess, not really my thing. But I see money as more deep than a true love relationship. I think that that perception is equally as valid. I think that the depth that you perceive within a particular, whether it's yourself or air or money or true love, is subjective on the individual. And I don't think
okay,
anyone's wrong.
so yeah, this is. I think we can bring it like full circle here because I think this is a consequence of knowing what you value, and so like your value will depend. Like a person's perception of fulfillment is correlated to their perception of what they have in life aligning with the values that they carry, and if their values are relationship, not only that, but deep relationship with another human being and their value isn't in intrinsically just breathing air, or existing. And for a person to know what they value, I think a person needs to know what they value to even begin to move in the direction of the experience of fulfillment. And what I think happens is not that those values lead them to the ultimate fulfillment, but I think you need to understand what you value subjectively to even have a chance to get to ultimate fulfillment, if that even exists. Maybe it doesn't, but what I'm confident exists is higher, deeper, and more stable forms of fulfillment over a period of time of growing up and seeing, as a consequence, the limits of what things can do to fulfill me. And we understand those limits of fulfillment of what things can do to fulfill me, particularly when we lose them. So if I have something that I've identified as a value and I'm like, I value this and I'm going to do it because this is the only thing I can see is fulfilling to me. I grow up from that or I learn from that in acquiring it, gaining that fulfillment, losing it. noticing that's the limit on that fulfillment, and maybe that losing it is necessary because of some natural constraint, like my lifespan, or it's limited to that other person um, having consistently seeing me as their lover or as whatever. Maybe they eventually find someone else. So it's limited to their own the agency and the autonomy of another person designating you specifically as a thing they want, which is a constraint. That's something that you don't have control over. That can flip like the wind someday, and that's going to be that will reveal the limitation of that subjective value. And naturally, what I believe the mind does is it can do two things. It can say, I'm going to try to find that thing again in another form. Or it can do three things. I'm going to try to find that thing in another form. And then it does that, it finds another person, then it must confront that constraint again in another form, whether it's through death or them leaving. The second thing it can do, it can say, screw this, I'm going to kill myself, or I'm going to give up, or I'm going to live a life of unfulfillment, or basically the give up path. Like you just give up on the idea of fulfillment. You live a life of passionless, um, loveless apathy. Or the third option is growing up and seeing this is never ultimately going to be that thing that gets me fulfillment in a stable way. And there's like this tiredness, there's like this passion, like you just sort of you see the loop of it. You see like, oh, this subjective value will never ultimately lead to the fulfillment that I want in a stable way. And I am tired of this unstable fulfillment. I am done. And then the mind's value shifts to something that it perceives as the next form of fulfillment. Okay, like what's more stable? What could be there as a stable fulfillment where I could include a love, where it doesn't throw that out. You're not like throwing out the idea of a love, but you're finding something where you can include that, and if it goes away, you still find that fulfillment, or you still experience that fulfillment, and maybe even when it's included, you experience the association of love and oxytocin, blah blah, pleasure, and when it goes away, there's still something there, like a fulfillment. There's still not this huge like giving up, or you need to find that thing again before you can experience life in the way you experienced it. And I think that's when your value then that's how values evolve. And I think the idea of love, when I was describing it, is something like that which is sustained when a relationship comes into one's life and when it falls away. And I also believe the purpose of relationships is to increase one's ability to stay at that in a stable way, um, independent of that individual being there or not. That goes into the topic of what's the purpose of a relationship, of a conscious relationship. Is it to be so attached to them that you lose yourself when they go, or is it to grow more into a fulfillment independent of who they are and what they're doing for you? And I think there's uh, something like that that's at the core of what a relationship is not supposed to be, but could be. Um, and so I think that's how values evolve, is through our getting what we want and losing it and seeing the constraints and then evolving our minds to find it something that's more stable. And that's why I say it's quote unquote higher, but not necessarily necessary for everyone to immediately go to that highest thing, because they need to experience the resistance or the restraint of the thing that they really, really want. And then they have to grow up. But they can't just grow up all at once before they get that thing and lose it.
Yeah, so I still always have challenges with the higher or better or deeper. I think that
Maybe
if
not
your
high. Let's just say it's
well, the way I would phrase it is, I would say that if your goal is to have a sustainable sense of fulfillment, then pursuing the dissociation pathway is probably one of the most likely, the best pathways to go on. If that is your goal, if your goal is to find the most sustainable source of fulfillment, if that's what you truly value, if that's where you truly find fulfillment, that is a great source. Um, but I would say that every individual would have to, like as you said, know your own values. And once you know your own values, you can determine which kind of fulfillment best fits with who you are, and then determine which pathway you should probably pursue.
That's a critic. I agree. I think that's critical. You can't arrive at any form. Well, you can arrive at some forms of fulfillment without doing that, but I think the more you do that, the more you're clear about it, the more you will feel you will have an ability to arrive at something of some real quality of fulfillment. And I do think that the sort of, I would call it not a like, it is a path of it is a path of seeing what's there that is not able to give you, um, I guess, yourself. Is that, I still, I know you're saying dissociation to highlight that you're disassociating with things in experience, but
Yeah,
I
it's just
also
a
challenge,
general term to try to refer to your worldview from my perspective. So it's just a general term I'm using to try to
yeah,
identify
I
your
also,
perspective.
yeah, but I also say that it is just I would say a recognizing of the limits of things in experience. So, and I would say it's not as much a dissociation as it is a developing of a dispassion, like it's dispassion for things, or it's seeing how far this can take me, and seeing that it can't take me any further than that, and seeing like, oh, this will still give me something. Like this isn't completely invaluable, but it will get me like 65. And my mind thinks it will get me infinity. Like the mind, when it thinks of a desire, or it thinks of something that will fulfill it, or a partner or whatever, the mind thinks of it as oftentimes as an infinite return. And that's why it's so excited. But the dissociation or whatever, it's not that you're like just throwing that away. Like there's a value there, but it's not infinite, it's not eternal. It's 65. It's this, it's 10 years, it's this, but it's the mind just stops projecting onto things this expectation, and it's just like this sort of um dispassion, or this sort of coming to this sort of state of like just knowing like this isn't going to be this eternal thing. And there can also be an okayness with that. Like I'm okay with that, and I accept that this is temporary. But naturally, the mind finds, at least in my understanding, it really craves this sort of um, ground, almost like a. The reason it's even trying to fulfill itself is because it wants to experience that. And if you ask the mind, do you want to continue to experience that? The answer tends to be yes, which is another way of saying, if in the next moment the mind wants this to continue, the mind, if you extend that and extrapolate that, the mind basically is asking, give me eternal fulfillment. Because
Yeah,
if you ask the mind, do you want fulfillment in this next moment? And it says no, like, I don't know if my mind, like, the idea of the mind doing that, it's,
I do that all the time. That's literally what a video game is. Like that's the God mode option, and I'm not pressing the God mode option. Do I want fulfillment now? Do I want to beat the boss
but that's still
now?
depending. That maybe it's not that you're saying I don't want fulfillment. It's you're saying I want the experience of challenge. I want the experience of anxiety, because if I imagine a world where those don't exist, that would be unfulfilling to me.
Sure, sure.
And you're the very idea of the mind not saying I just want to have this content, stable, whatever, is the mind saying in this next moment, I want to continue my enjoyment of this. And if I were to take that, like the mind, like it almost feels like it's like it almost feels like an axiom to the mind. And I don't know if it is. Um, and even when the mind wants to end its life, it's still operating from that space of like, wanting this next moment, if it's suffering, to end that suffering.
Yeah.
So it's still in this direction of like, let's see if we like the idea of nothing is more fulfilling to the mind than the idea of something that's suffering. And so if I just extrapolate that, it's like the mind is craving the stability. But I think when we imagine stability and we imagine this, the mind naturally goes to the idea of like this blank, undynamic, boring, like version of reality where you're actually not respecting your values, or the process of life. And you're sort of projecting this idea of what fulfillment would be, but in reality, fulfillment might look like you continuing creation, you working on your art, you playing a game that's very challenging. And I think I want to be careful with how I project the idea of fulfillment, even in my own experience, and also in your experience and in other people's experience, as like a singular idea of some yogi or some singular idea of enlightenment. When in reality, I think the manifold manifestations of what that could look like may just be what reality is doing, like what reality looks like now, but where people are, um, like I don't know what it would look like, is what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to project necessarily one version of this on everyone. I think that's why I think that's a beautiful part of it. I think it would be sad if it was only one thing.
Oh yeah, absolutely agree. I think I agreed with like everything you said there. That's a very good congruence of our worldviews right there. I think our next conversation should be about the immorality of nature as I see it, and how you see it as not immoral. And that would be a
Yes.
good follow-up conversation. But yeah, it's getting late. It's like almost 11 o'clock now.
Yeah, I was going to mention like, are we going to continue forever, or are we going to eventually wrap this? But I think it's a good
Literally
note to wrap.
forever. Like we're just gonna keep going. End of the universe. Keep going
It's a good time to,
for
yeah, to
sure.
conclude. And yeah, I
Yeah, thanks
guess
for
if
coming
there's
on. I
anything,
really appreciate it. It was a great conversation. Do you want to give a shout out to your podcast and any social medias you want to link?
yeah. So my YouTube channel is where I post my content, and it's at Cusp of Infinity on YouTube, and I have some good conversations on there. Just look up of Infinity. One of the conversations I enjoyed was one with Joey Lott. So you can put that name in with his name, or you can put it in with my name, especially if it's hard to find. Sometimes it doesn't list right now. But give that a look. I'd love to hear your guys' comments and interact with you and just share more ideas because that's one of my favorite things to do.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. I'll probably see you either this weekend or next weekend for the next cacao thing.
Yeah, so this weekend is the Socratic Circle on
Yeah,
presence, and I'll see you soon, Tom. It was a pleasure.
absolutely. Have a nice night.
You too.